you give us the understanding of what we know about how the NOx enzyme and the stress response has so many multi layers to it?
Absolutely. Well, what I'd like to do, I'm going to do a screen share here. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to share a screen here that, and you're seeing the screen okay there?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So what you'll see here in the dead center, and I'll try to draw here if I can. Let me get my drawing tool here. There we go. So right here in the center, there's an enzyme called NOx, NADPH oxidase. And I've been talking about this for a long time. And the reason I've been talking about this for a long time, I believe it's central to what is occurring with so many things that we're seeing today. Now, what this stands for is NADPH oxidase. And what that means is that when we're faced with a pathogen, a bacteria or something else, again, what a miracle we are. We take iron, we take oxygen from iron, and we take an electron from NADPH, and this NOx enzyme makes a free radical called superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, and that makes something called mast cells. Now, these mast cells are white blood cells that protect us. If we didn't have these mast cells, we would die of infection. We wouldn't survive. This is what protects us. Then these mast cells say, okay, I'm going to make some what are called cytokines, inflammatory molecules, and I'm going to make some histamine, and we're really going to kick up a fuss here, and we're going to kill this pathogen. And again, if we didn't have this, we'd die of infection. So this is not bad. Critical for survival. Now, what happens is I am really intrigued by a molecule called NADPH. NADPH is made inside the body, and we can have genetic mutations if we don't make enough of it. It wears completely two different hats. One, it helps make something called nitric oxide down here in the bottom right. Nitric oxide is very, very important for us to make to have good blood flow. And if we don't have enough nitric oxide, we're going to have high blood pressure and all kinds of things related to our cardiovascular system. So we need to have adequate nitric oxide. And you can see here that NADPH is a cofactor to make that. So if you don't have enough nitric oxide, many times cold hands and feet. Most people have never heard of this antioxidant called thioredoxin, but it's a really important one. And again, it needs NADPH to keep recycling this so it keeps doing its job. Many people have heard of glutathione, and glutathione is the master antioxidant. And after it does its job, it becomes oxidized. And again, we need NADPH to recycle it. Okay. So if we don't have enough NADPH, we are not going to recycle that antioxidant. Now, we also make something called heme. Yes, that's kind of like your hemoglobin. And that heme needs to turn into ferritin. Once again, we need NADPH. We need something called biliverdin that calms down mast cells, NADPH. And NADPH is used in a lot of processes, but a final one we're looking at here is how we stimulate the production of antioxidants. But look at what happens here. NADPH does all those good things, but when the NOx enzyme says we've got a foreign invader, it's kind of like the National Guard. It stops what it's doing and goes fights a battle. Now, when we have a short infection, again, without this, we die of infection. So we shut off our not shut off, slow down our antioxidants. And it took me a while to figure that out. Well, it makes sense when you have a desire to kill something, you want a temporary reduction in your antioxidants. So we go in for the kill, and then ideally we go back to homeostasis, and the antioxidants start doing their job. But if you look at this chart here, you'll see that EMF, sulfites, dopamine, homocysteine, something called aldosterone, air pollution, and I'm hearing from so many of my clients in California who are struggling from the air pollution, glutamate, the iron, something called oxalates, high histamine, and upregulated mTOR all stimulate this excessively. So we make superoxide, we make hydrogen peroxide, we make mast cells, we make cytokines, and we make histamine. Now, so many people have high histamine problems. And if someone's interested, they want to hear an entire lecture on histamine. If you just go on YouTube and search Dr. Jill Carnahan, who's extremely well known, we've done a couple of interviews, and we just did a whole interview on histamine where I go through all the problems with histamine. It was done in, see, it would have been done in late September, or no, or mid October. So this histamine has to be broken down. So there's a molecule called cortisol that is made by the adrenal glands, and it actually comes from progesterone. So if we're low in progesterone or have a genetic mutation that we don't convert progesterone to cortisol, or the adrenal glands are weak, we don't make enough cortisol. It's not on this chart, but cortisol also turns into cortisone, which is anti-inflammatory. That's why people sometimes take prednisone. Cortisol inhibits histamine. So this is why so many people are in adrenal fatigue, because they're just making so much histamine. And we'll get into that. There's also an enzyme called dynamine oxidase that breaks down histamine. People can have mutations on this dynamine oxidase if they don't make enough of that. And then sometimes people think, well, I need to be healthy, so I'm going to start eating some healthy foods like kombucha and miso and sauerkraut. They're all high histamine foods. So if you have some difficulty with this enzyme and you start eating high histamine foods, you can actually make things worse. I hate when that happens, when somebody thinks they're making dietary changes to feel better and they feel worse. Then there's an enzyme called histamine N-methyltransferase that clears histamine. You can have genetic mutations on here. Or we need a cofactor called SAMe that's part of methylation. And if we don't have enough SAMe, it doesn't matter whether this gene is mutated or not, we're not going to clear the histamine. And then when we make mast cells, that will actually inhibit histamine. And then finally, there's a process called glucuronidation that clears histamine. So if we have anything that would be overproducing the histamine and any of these pathways that don't clear it, that histamine can go high. And so many people are having allergies. And people tend to think of histamine as just runny nose, but it affects the mental state. It can be excitatory. It can affect the cardiovascular system. It can affect the digestive system. Back to my original question, what was my health challenge? I just found out recently I had high histamine. Then there's also, I'm very excited about this, there's an enzyme called HDC, histidine decarbolase, that turns an amino acid called histidine into histamine. And lo and behold, that's why I had my flare this summer. I had upregulated HDC. So I started doing some iodine, did some things to convert, not allow testosterone to go into estrogen, started drinking some green tea and reducing some of the high histidine foods. And within days, I went back into remission again, probably induced by stress, by everything that was occurring. And then the MAOA gene can be difficult as well, mutated that we don't clear the histamine. Now, we used to think that, histamine was allergies and let's just take some antihistamines and all will be well. However, I do have a little concern when you take an antihistamine because one of my question is, well, if you block it, that's what they do. They're blockers. Where else does it go and what does it do? So we might put a roadblock up and it may just go somewhere else. So antihistamines are fine, but interestingly, long-term use of them depletes the DAO enzyme that breaks down histamine. Hate when that happens. Now, here's what's really exciting here, Dr. Rosen. And this was all based upon peer-reviewed literature. We didn't make this stuff up. That when we make histamine, it will come back and it will stimulate an enzyme called renin. And, if anybody's ever studied medically, they know it's the RAAS system, where renin stimulates something called angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, and then aldosterone. And renin is stimulated by high glucose, free radical called superoxide. We've already spoken about mast cells and histamine, dopamine or testosterone. All of those will stimulate this. Angiotensin 1 and 2 are inflammatory and vasoconstrictive. There's an enzyme called ACE2 that takes these and puts them into something that is anti-inflammatory and vasodilative. Aldosterone will cause you to hold on to sodium, excrete potassium. And then this angiotensin 2 will stimulate interleukin 6. I am really stunned by how many things interleukin 6 will cause. Now, it's modulatory, so it can have some benefit, but again, in excess, it's a problem. Interleukin 6 is behind depression, suicidal ideations, diabetes, dementia, and the list goes on and on. Oh, inflammatory bowel disease is all created by excess interleukin 6. But look what interleukin 6 does. It stimulates the NOx enzyme. And then, whoa, the NOx enzyme stimulates interleukin 6. So, one of the things we're looking at is, do people have genetic mutations in renin? And when they do, they're actually gain of function that they go faster. I'm very concerned with mutations in ACE2. And what I'm finding in our consultations is that when people have mutations in ACE2, which is lack of function, we're not turning these inflammatory vasoconstrictive molecules into anti-inflammatory vasodilative. Now, what's interesting, COVID comes in using ACE2. And so consequently, that's why for some people, they get COVID. They didn't even know they had it. Other people had mild symptoms, and other people are gasping for breath and dying. Likely multiple causes. And I'm not saying this is all of it. But if ACE2 is already weak, COVID comes in, we could theoretically be making more interleukin 6 and NOx. And there is literature out there that the cytokine storm, not COVID itself, but the cytokine storm, is related to upregulation of NOx2. And interleukin 6 plays a role. Now, bradykinin is also getting into that. And I don't think we'll have time for that, but ACE2 also breaks down bradykinin. So it's like interesting. So as COVID comes in and weakens this ACE2, that creates a problem. So we've got histamine stimulating this. Then as we stimulate the NOx enzyme, we make superoxide. Superoxide will combine with nitric oxide to make something called peroxynitrite, which is very oxidizing, depletes your glutathione, and this superoxide comes back and stimulates the renin enzyme. So what do we have here? We have what's called a positive feedback loop, that this thing just feeds upon itself. And look who some of the culprits are, mycotoxins. And again, we're concerned mycotoxins are getting stronger. Borrelia, Lyme disease. So I find the sickest of the sick are the ones that have Lyme and mycotoxins stimulating these mast cells. Now, just as a side note, these mast cells will stimulate something called interleukin 13. And if there's mutations on here, this will come back and further stimulate the mast cells and spin this thing even faster. So I've named this the Holmes cycle based upon a relative of mine who had a lot of influence. And I just gave it that name because the Miller cycle just didn't have a ring to it. I don't know why I did. And then we've also come up with the name, the NADPH steel, where this precious NADPH is being overused by the NOx enzyme to make the mast cells. And as we just pointed out, this NADPH is needed for all those other important things. So there can be genetic mutations that you don't make enough NADPH. Then if you're stealing it to make all this inflammation, you're in a positive feedback loop. Now, interestingly, aluminum also stimulates the NOx enzyme. That's why it's used as an adjuvant in some vaccinations. So what are we doing? We're smearing aluminum chlorohydrate into our armpits. What were we thinking? So I would encourage anyone who's using an antiperspirant, give serious thought to changing their mind on that. And I was just at a conference over the weekend where more pathways, more antioxidants are impacted by aluminum. And just think what we did. We drank Coca-Cola out of aluminum cans for a while. Brilliant, right? And we sometimes have aluminum pots and pans. So, and aluminum will also inhibit the the making of BH4, which is needed to make your nitric oxide. And if we don't have nitric oxide made, we get more superoxide made. So again, we've just created this perfect storm. So I believe there's so many things stimulating the NOx enzyme. Interestingly, just learned at a conference this weekend, vitamin D calms this down, vitamin A stimulates it. So particularly if we're concerned about the cytokine storm, I mean, we need vitamin A, but maybe taking excess to think that we're going to protect our immune system may not be wise. And then mTOR, if we want, we can talk about that a little bit, but that is the growth of new cells. And without that, life doesn't exist. But um, it needs to be balanced with autophagy, the cleaning of the cells. And again, we don't have time to get into all of it, but if we don't have this mTOR and autophagy balanced, this mTOR will stimulate the NOx enzyme. So when I said there's no easy answers, uh, you can see now why. Now, what I think is happening a lot of time, I think when you look at this whole pattern here, I believe this is happening in a lot of people. Upregulated NOx, upregulated mast cells, upregulated histamine, coming back here and spinning this around. But there's probably 50 different ways this could occur. If you got glyphosate exposure and you don't turn your sulfites into sulfates, or you have genetic mutations that you don't turn your sulfites into sulfates, it could be the sulfites that's stimulating this. If you are living in California and you're breathing all this air pollution from the fires, it could be this that's stimulating it. If you're not methylating properly and your homocysteine is high, it could be the high homocysteine. Um, if you have Clostridia or you have genetic mutations in your dopamine and norepinephrine, it could be the dopamine. If you're of English or Irish descent, oftentimes they overabsorb iron, and that could be an issue. Or many times Northern Europeans and Germans have high glutamate. That will not only stimulate NOx, but inhibit ACE2. Or if you have spring and fall allergies, the histamine will create it. Or if you live in a moldy house, or you're exposed to so many xenobiotics that are, toxins, or xenoestrogens, or have Lyme disease, or, have your router in your bedroom, or live next to a cell tower. There are just so many things environmentally. Then if you have genetic mutations in ACE, if you have genetic mutations in HMOX that calm this down, if you don't make enough superoxide dismutase, if you don't make enough glutathione, if you overproduce histamine from histidine, or as we showed earlier, have weakness in any of the pathways that clear histamine, those can all be contributing factors. So I wish I said, and by the way, here's the magic bullet. We don't have any of those. And if somebody tells you that, be very suspicious, because there isn't a magic bullet to fix this. So I think what we have to do is we have to get away from the pill for the ill and look at the individual person. And, one of the ways that you can tell if your adrenals are tired, you can do cortisol tests that'll measure your cortisol. Not every case of POTS is adrenal fatigue, but many times it is. If your blood pressure drops and you get dizzy when you stand up, that can be a factor. If you have vinegar and all of a sudden you're sneezing and feel terrible, you may not be breaking down your histamine. If you eat beef or pork chops and you feel terrible, you may have your histidine to histamine conversion being upregulated. So there is just so many answers. And if somebody says, Bob, what do I do? My answer would be, I don't know. We have to look at that person's genome. Did you live in a moldy house? Did you live next to farms where you had a well and possibly you're drinking glyphosate? Do you have genetic mutations in the heme cycle? Is your homocysteine too high? Those are all the things that I think health professionals need to be looking at, because we don't have simple answers. And unfortunately, we can try to do things that we think are helpful, and they can actually be harmful. So sometimes when people are inflamed, it's like, well, I need glutathione, so I'm going to take some N-acetylcysteine. Well, if you've got genetic mutations here or mycotoxins that inhibit it, that cysteine can actually be inflammatory. So then we think, okay, I need some glutathione. So master antioxidant can't do any harm there. If you don't take your oxidized glutathione back to the reduced because of NADPH deficiency, hold on to your head here, Dr. Rosen. The glutathione will combine with oxygen to make superoxide, nitric oxide to make peroxynitrite. How paradoxical is this? Under the wrong conditions, taking glutathione could actually oxidize your DNA and deplete your glutathione. So you think you're doing good taking glutathione, and you're actually backfiring. And then there's a big trend towards NAD. So, you'll hear lots of podcasts on NAD, the youth molecule. Absolutely true. It supports your PARP enzymes. It supports mTOR versus autophagy. It helps you make your antioxidants. But if you've got mutations in NQO1, you can be stuck up here, which is inflammatory. And a hypothesis I have, which I think we'll find to be true, if you take too much NADPH or make too much NADPH while this is upregulated, you can feed the inflammation because this wears two hats. I often speak to physicians who do um, NAD infusions. And for some people, it's like, oh my gosh, best thing I ever did. And other people will say, the worst thing I ever did. Same with glutathione. Best thing I ever did, worst thing I ever did. Same way with methylfolate. People see I have MTHFR. Oh my gosh, I need methylfolate. If you don't have enough NADPH, methylfolate is actually inflammatory and excitatory. So we can backfire so many ways. And we talked about, fermented foods. People think I'm going to rebuild my gut with fermented foods. But if they already have high histamine and they don't have enough DAO, the fermented foods backfire. And then finally, sometimes people say, well, I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to do smoothies. I'm going to do spinach, kale, and beet smoothies. And they're very high in oxalates. And if you have a leaky gut and you don't break down the oxalates, you've just made yourself worse by eating healthy. So that's why we call it the 3D chess game played underwater. No easy answers. And that's why I believe health professionals need to be measuring the DNA, looking where there's potential. And the key word is always potential weakness, and trying to step in and support it so that we can, bring homeostasis back so we don't make the mast cells, the histamine, the superoxide, deplete our glutathione, wear out our adrenals, jack up our glutamate. And then finally, when we have inflammation or infection, that can inhibit your glutamate to GABA conversion. Glutamate's what makes you intelligent, highly motivated go-getter. GABA's the don't worry, relax, be happy. But when we have inflammation or infection or mutations in the GAD enzyme or deficiencies in B6 and magnesium, many things can go wrong here, not just SNPs. I'm not just a SNP guy that, the SNPs is everything. If you've got mutations and you have B6 deficiency and magnesium deficiency, it's not going to work. But you could have no SNPs at all. Perfect. But if you're depleted in B6 and magnesium and you've got inflammation or infection, that GAD enzyme, it doesn't matter whether you have perfect SNPs or not, it's not going to work, and that glutamate's not going to turn into GABA. So am I all about the SNPs? Yeah, but you got to look well beyond that. It's not just whether you have SNPs. Do you have the cofactors? Is it being overwhelmed? Is there anything that's suppressing it? So it makes it so complex. So that's why saying I need to take this nutrient based upon this SNP is flawed. We've got to look at a much bigger picture than that. So I believe what we're seeing today, why people are so stressed out, is we've got excess glutamate, we've got excess histamine, and we have excess dopamine. And I'll wrap up my thoughts on the dopamine because dopamine will stimulate the renin enzymes. So one of the interesting enzymes that breaks down dopamine is called something called COMT. And again, you can have mutations on COMT, but if you've got extra estrogen and low testosterone, testosterone supports COMT, estrogen suppresses. This COMT enzyme is not going to work whether you've got mutations or not. And then if you start eating a lot of cheese, tyramine foods, or you start taking boatloads of quercetin because you think that's going to break down your histamine, you can be jacking up your dopamine. And then SAMe is a cofactor. So again, if everything's perfect here, but you don't have the cofactor, it's like having a brand new car without gas. So there's a lot that can go wrong over here. So we can't just look at COMT and say, oh, because I have COMT, this or that. I'll never forget, I had a client who was having, uh, headaches, felt terrible, uh, and he was eating grapes and cheese, which was inhibiting COMT. Now, had weakness there to begin with, testosterone was low, estrogen was high, was eating cheese. I don't care what your COMTs are looking like, you're not going to clear your dopamine. And your dopamine, when it's high, makes you very irritated. And you can also have mutations in the DBH enzyme, but Clostridia in the gut will also impair dopamine and norepinephrine conversion. So I hope that gave you an idea as to how many things can go wrong here. And I don't want to be discouraging. I'm just saying we really have to do our due diligence and avoid some of these things. Make sure you don't have mold in your house. Uh, give serious consideration to using aluminum in your armpits. Uh, be aware of if histamine foods create a problem. Get your genomics done, see where you might have some functional weakness. We're not talking about disease SNPs here. That's what a geneticist does. We're talking about functional genomics where you look as though some function may be off and then taking the appropriate remedial steps. So to sum it up, I believe that because of things that we've done to the environment, we are overstimulating uh, the they are overstimulating the NOx enzyme. We're overstimulating the mast cells. We're overstimulating the histamine. It's all feeding back to just be one vicious cycle that keeps on going.
Amazing, amazing stuff. And it answers the question that I get. And I'm sure, well, I don't know if you get it very much, but I get it a lot is why do I need to have a genetic test? And especially for the people that listen to this podcast, Bob, they're exhausted, they're burnt out, and they're usually conditioned to think about the 4-point saliva test. And I say, well, we need to do a genetic test. And why would I need to do a genetic test? So I now have a new educational tool to tell them, which is great. And thank you so much.